It was just another routine delivery. A quiet, almost mundane day on the job for the young driver, who was used to making stops in suburban neighborhoods without much thought. But today was different. As he pulled up to the house of a woman he'd never met, something told him this delivery was going to be more than just handing over a package. The door swung open slowly, revealing an elderly woman with a kind smile, her presence exuding a quiet grace that seemed out of place in the hustle of the city. She asked for a moment of his time, just enough for a simple favor. She had lived in the same house for decades, and there were small things she couldn't manage any more, things like reaching the top shelf or carrying heavy bags from the car. The driver didn't think twice. He helped her without hesitation, feeling a deep sense of purpose in the small acts of kindness. But as he spent more time in her home, chatting while helping her with these little tasks, he began to notice something unusual. Her bookshelves were lined with first editions, rare volumes, and stacks of novels with covers that had the names of some of the world's most acclaimed authors. Intrigued, he asked her about them. Her answer, soft yet revealing, would change everything he thought he knew about her. She wasn't just any ordinary elderly woman, she was a legendary figure in the literary world, a celebrated author whose work had shaped generations. But why had she been so humble? Why hadn't she revealed her identity? The more he learned, the more questions swirled in his mind. Who was she really? And why was she living so quietly, far from the spotlight? Was there something she wanted to hide? And could his simple act of kindness have led to something much bigger than he ever expected? The story was just beginning, but the driver was already caught in a web of mystery, and he had no idea where it would lead. As the day wore on, the driver found himself lingering longer than expected. At first, he had only meant to drop off the package and help her with a few errands. But something about the woman, the aura around her, kept him tethered. As he dusted off some of the shelves and organized the books she could no longer manage, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking in the footsteps of a forgotten legend. The elderly woman who had introduced herself simply as just a neighbor sat in her cozy armchair, knitting. She wasn't trying to impress him with her stories, and yet there was an air of mystery about her that he couldn't ignore. Each word she spoke about her past seemed to hold a hidden meaning. When she mentioned her writing days, her tone was absent, as if the words weren't quite as important to her anymore. It made him wonder if there was something she wasn't saying. And then, as if almost reading his mind, she paused and looked up, locking eyes with him. There was a glimmer of something, sadness perhaps, or even regret. "You must have heard of me," she said, her voice soft. He hesitated, unsure of what to say. I've seen some of your books, I think," he responded cautiously, trying to keep the conversation light. Her smile faltered for just a moment, but it quickly returned. "I doubt it. They haven't been in print for a long time." That struck him as odd. Why hadn't her books been printed in years? Weren't they classics? The thought nagged at him, but he didn't push it further. After all, what did he know about the world of literature? Still, the odd feeling wouldn't leave him. He had to know more, but he didn't want to press her. He had only just met her after all. Yet something gnawed at him, pulling at his curiosity like an invisible thread. As the day began to turn to dusk, the woman suggested he take a break and have some tea with her. He agreed, though the tension in the room was palpable. The quiet, almost too quiet, was only interrupted by the occasional rustle of her knitting needles. She poured the tea with practiced grace, as though every movement had been repeated 1,000 times before. "What made you give up writing?" he asked, his curiosity finally taking over. She set the teapot down with a deliberate motion, her fingers trembling slightly. "Sometimes, life doesn't let you do the things you love. We all have our time, don't we?" she said, the words steeped in a sadness that felt too deep to unpack in one conversation. He felt the weight of her words, but didn't know how to respond. It must have been hard. "To walk away from something you loved," he ventured. She gave him a half smile, a knowing look. "Not as hard as you might think. You see, my books were never just my own. They belong to the world now. And sometimes, the world doesn't want to keep you in it." Her cryptic response left him confused. What was she really trying to say? It was clear now that she had a history, a rich past filled with accomplishments, but it seemed as if she had stepped away from it for reasons unknown. But why? What had happened to her that made her retreat into this quiet, unassuming life? The conversation shifted as the night deepened, the glow from the lamp casting long shadows across the room. The driver was so absorbed in his thoughts that he didn't notice when she suddenly stood and walked to a nearby drawer, pulling out a tattered, leather-bound book. She handed it to him wordlessly. He took it with curiosity, noting how worn it looked, the edges of the pages frayed from years of use. It was a novel, one he had never heard of before. The title was faded, barely legible, but he could just make out a few words, whispers in the dark. This was your first? He asked, gently flipping through the pages. She nodded. It's the one that started it all. But it's not what you think. His eyes lingered on the pages, trying to understand the significance of this particular book. The writing was beautiful, haunting even, and the story was gripping. It seemed almost too real, too raw. And yet, there was something about it that made him uneasy, like it wasn't just fiction. He couldn't put his finger on it, but a sense of foreboding crept up his spine. Why don't people talk about this one? He asked. I've never heard anyone mention it. The elderly woman's gaze darkened for a moment. Because some stories are too dangerous to tell, she replied softly. And this one, well, it's better left forgotten. The room felt colder now, the air thick with an unspoken tension. The driver couldn't help but wonder if the book was more than just a work of fiction. What had she meant by dangerous? Why had she felt the need to walk away from it all? As he stared at the book in his hands, a voice in his mind whispered that he shouldn't open it. He should just leave. He should forget this strange afternoon and go back to his normal life. But the lure of the unknown, of a hidden truth waiting to be uncovered, was too strong to resist. He had to know more. But before he could ask another question, the woman's face grew serious. Listen, she said, her voice lower now, I don't want you to make the same mistake I did. Don't get involved with this. It's too late for me, but you can still walk away. The driver felt a chill run down his spine as he closed the book. What do you mean? What's so dangerous about this? She reached over and gently took the book from him, her hands shaking. She placed it back in the drawer, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made his stomach twist. Because it's not just a story. It's real, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. And the people who read it, really read it, they change. They're never the same again. The weight of her words hung in the air between them. He could feel the atmosphere shift, the quiet tension now charged with something else, something darker. Just as he opened his mouth to speak, the doorbell rang, interrupting the moment. The woman froze, her eyes widening in alarm. She turned to him, her face pale. You have to leave. Now! Before he could protest, she ushered him quickly toward the door, her hands trembling. The driver had no idea what was going on, but he knew one thing for sure, something was terribly wrong. He stepped out onto the porch, his heart racing. He didn't even get the chance to turn around and say goodbye before the door slammed shut behind him. He stood there for a moment, confusion and unease swirling in his mind. What was happening? Why had everything shifted so suddenly? What had the woman meant by it's real? As he made his way back to his truck, he noticed something odd, a shadow moving in the window, where she had just been standing moments before. And that's when it hit him. He wasn't sure he'd be able to walk away from this, even if he tried. The mystery, the unanswered questions, the strange feeling that there was something bigger going on, it had already taken root in his mind. But he didn't know yet, not for certain, that this was only the beginning. That's quite a long conclusion, but I can definitely write a detailed and satisfying ending that wraps up the story with suspense, resolution, and emotional depth. Here's a compelling continuation. The driver's pulse pounded in his ears as he stood outside the woman's door, the finality of her words sinking in. The street was eerily silent except for the soft rustling of leaves in the cold night air. The warm glow from inside her house had vanished, leaving only darkness beyond the window. The shift was too sudden, too unnatural. Something wasn't right. He hesitated for a moment, his instincts screaming at him to leave, but his